The mid-90s was a strange time. I remember people still clinging to cassette recorders and pagers, and the internet was just an abstract idea that some people talked about in whispers. In a way, it was a time of innocence, but everything about those years, for me, has been wrapped up in a complex web of emotions that I've never been able to untangle. I often think about those days, usually when the house is quiet and there is nothing but the hum of memories to keep me company. It was then, in those fleeting years of uncertainty and transformation, that my stepson Ethan changed my life. I married his father, Richard, after a beautiful affair that swept me off my feet. Richard was older, more confident, and an established man, which made me feel better. He had his own life, and I was tired of the constant hustle and bustle. When I moved into their house, Ethan was just under 18, on the cusp of adulthood, but still a boy in many ways. He had his mother's eyes, a soft shade of green that always seemed to have a question in them, and sometimes he studied me as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't solve. Our relationship was simple at first. I was a new stepmother, trying to navigate the already established family relationships without stepping on anyone's toes. I knew Ethan resented me at first, and why wouldn't he? His father had found someone new and I was the intruder. But as time went on, things began to change. It started with small moments, a shared smile when Richard told a corny joke at dinner, a glance across the room when I caught Ethan having a midnight snack. Little by little, our protective walls were crumbling. Ethan helped me in the garden on the weekends, digging with his hands in the ground with an earnestness that reminded me of childhood. He wasn't much of a talker, but he listened, really listened, when I spoke. He asked about my life before his father, my dreams, and even the things I was afraid of. It was as if, over time, he decided that I wasn't just a replacement for his mother, but an independent person he wanted to understand. The day I realized something had changed between us came in the late summer of 1996. Richard was away on business, and there was a strange emptiness in the house. Ethan and I sat on the back porch and watched the sun dip below the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of pink and orange. I made us iced tea, and we sat quietly enjoying the warmth of the evening. Ethan turned to me, his gaze soft but intense, and said, "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." His words froze in the air, filled with heavy meaning. I felt their weight and saw him looking at me no longer with the eyes of a boy, but of a young man trying to understand what he couldn't express. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a harmless comment. But the way his eyes lingered on mine, the way his hand briefly touched mine as he handed me the glass, all spoke of something deeper, something neither of us could deny. I didn't know how to deal with it. I cared about Ethan even more than I thought I ever could, and there was something about the way he perceived me that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating, but also frightening. I knew it couldn't last, but over time it did. Those warm glances, the hands that touched for far too long, the silence that grew thicker when Richard was around. And in those quiet, kind moments, Ethan let me know without words that he had fallen in love with me. There was a day in late September that I remembered for a long time. It was one of those golden afternoons when the light streamed through the trees and the air was crisp and hinted that fall was approaching. Ethan and I were working in the garden, and after taking a break, we sat down on the grass, watching the leaves sway gently in the wind. He turned to me, his eyes filled with the same intensity, and asked about my childhood, how I grew up, what my favorite memories were. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't opened up to anyone in years. There was something about Ethan's presence that made me feel safe, like I could share parts of myself that I usually kept hidden. We talked for hours that day until the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple. As we sat there, the silence between us grew heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions. Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers touching mine, and for a moment I let myself forget about everything else, Richard, the boundaries we weren't supposed to cross, the implications of what we were feeling. In that fleeting moment, it was just the two of us, and it seemed to me that the rest of the world had vanished. The night it ended is etched in my memory like a scar. Richard came home early from his trip, tired and cranky, and found Ethan and me in the kitchen. It wasn't anything special, just a touch, his hand resting on my shoulder as I washed the dishes. But there was a tenderness to it that Richard couldn't ignore. He saw it in Ethan's eyes, in the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. Richard simply said, "Ethan, we need to talk," in that low, controlled voice he used when he was holding back his anger. They entered the office, and I could hear their muffled voices, the tension seeping through the walls. I knew what was going on. Richard was telling him that he had to leave, that everything that was going on between us was wrong, and that Ethan didn't belong in our house if he couldn't respect that. I wanted to intervene, to protect him somehow, but I froze, torn between my love for Richard and feelings for Ethan that I couldn't put a name to. Ethan left that night. He packed a bag, his eyes were red but dry, and he hugged me before walking out the door. He whispered, "You'll always be dear to me," and then he left. The house seemed even emptier after that, not just because he was gone, but because the silence was filled with all that was left unspoken, all the feelings we had buried beneath the surface. In the weeks that followed, the emptiness in the house only seemed to increase. Richard tried to act as if nothing had happened, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. We sat at the dining room table in silence, and only the clinking of cutlery broke the silence. I knew he blamed me, even if he never said it out loud. He blamed me for letting Ethan get too close, for not setting boundaries, for everything that had come between us. And in a way, I blamed myself, too. Richard never talked about it again, and neither did I. Life went on as it always does. But even now, there are moments when I sit on that very back porch and think about Ethan. I wonder where he is, what he's doing, if he's ever found someone who understands him like I do. And sometimes I think about those summer evenings, the warmth of his gaze, and how he made me feel like I was being seen, really seen, for the first time in a long time. There are days when I imagine what might have happened if things had been different. If Richard hadn't come home early in the evening, if I'd been braver, if Ethan had stayed. I wonder if we would have found a way to make things work, or if things would have fallen apart in the end. It's a question that will never be answered, and maybe that's even better. But the memories still remain, like a melody that plays quietly in the background, always there, always reminding me of what once was. Sometimes I think about contacting Ethan just to see how he's doing, to hear his voice again. But I know it's better to let the past stay where it is and leave those memories intact. The life I have now is good, and I love Richard in my own way. But there is a part of me that will always belong to those summer days, to the boy with the green eyes who saw me like no one else ever has. And maybe that's enough, to know that for a brief moment I was truly seen and truly loved.